I need to tell you something I was never supposed to speak about. Something that still wakes me at 3 in the morning with my heart hammering against my ribs, like it's trying to escape. For 23 years I wore the uniform with pride, collected medals I thought meant something, followed orders I believed served a greater good. But there are moments in a life that divide everything into before and after. Moments when the ground beneath your carefully constructed reality cracks open and shows you the abyss underneath. Mine came in the form of a phone call on a January evening, a voice I didn't recognize speaking, words that made no sense, summoning me to a place that shouldn't exist. They said it was a matter of national security, that my particular expertise was required, that I should tell no one and bring nothing but my clearance credentials. The way the voice trembled, slightly at the end, trying so hard to sound official while barely containing something that might have been fear or wonder. That's what I remember most. I packed a single bag, kissed my wife without explaining where I was going, and drove through the night toward coordinates that would lead me so far from everything I understood about the world that I sometimes wonder if I ever truly came back. The facility revealed itself like a secret the mountains had been keeping for decades, camouflaged among the prayer flags and ancient stone that marked the roof of the world. The air was so thin up there that every breath felt borrowed, insufficient, as if the atmosphere itself was rationing what it would give to intruders. They met me at a checkpoint that appeared suddenly from the swirling white, armed guards whose eyes held that particular hollowness of men who've seen something they can't reconcile with their training. The commanding officer who escorted me deeper into the compound walked too quickly, spoke too precisely. His words clipped and rehearsed like he'd been practicing how to explain the impossible. He used phrases like unprecedented biological discovery and potential, threat assessment and complete information quarantine. But beneath the military jargon I could hear the tremor of a man trying to convince himself he hadn't lost his mind. We descended through reinforced corridors carved into the living rock, past security checkpoints, with technology I'd never seen deployed, past scientists who wouldn't meet my eyes, past a smell that was neither animal nor human but something anciently other. The temperature dropped with each level until my breath became visible, until I was walking through my own fog of disbelief, until we stopped before a door that looked like it was built to contain something from nightmares. He briefed me there in that frozen hallway with his back against the wall and his hand never straying far from his sidearm. Told me they'd been tracking reports for decades that everyone dismissed as folklore, superstition, the fantasies of altitude-sick climbers and isolated villagers. But 3 months ago a geological survey team had found something in a collapsed ice cave, something injured and dying that they couldn't leave behind and couldn't explain. They'd brought it here, stabilized it, studied it from behind reinforced glass and sedation protocols. But now it was awake and they needed someone with interrogation experience, someone with psychological operations training, someone expendable enough that if this went sideways my disappearance could be explained away. The way he said that last part, with his eyes finally meeting mine with something like apologetic resignation, that's when I understood. I was standing at a threshold I could never uncross. He handed me a file so heavily redacted it was more black than white, photographs that my brain refused to process properly, medical data that read like someone had mixed primate physiology with something from evolutionary pots we never took. Then he opened the door and the smell hit me fully, musk and mineral and mountain cold and something else, something that smelled like time itself had learned to breathe. I want to tell you I was brave, that my training held, that I walked into that containment room with professional detachment and steady hands. But I'd be lying, and I'm done with lies now. Done with the comfortable stories we tell ourselves to avoid the truths that undo us, because there are moments when everything you think you know about reality becomes irrelevant. When you stand before something that shouldn't exist according to every rational framework you've built your life upon, and you realize that the world has always been stranger and older and more mysterious than we've dared to imagine. The reinforced glass was thick enough to distort slightly, and through it I could see the shape of something massive and impossible, sitting perfectly still in the corner of that concrete cell with its eyes already fixed on the door, already fixed on me, as if it had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally see it truly. I took one breath, then another, feeling my heart rate spike despite every attempt at control, and stepped inside to meet a legend that would destroy everything I thought I understood about history, humanity, and the hidden warnings we've spent centuries learning to ignore. The containment room was colder than the hallways, but not from refrigeration. Something about the presence itself seemed to draw warmth from the air, from my bones, from the fluorescent lights that flickered slightly as I moved closer to the reinforced barrier separating us. I've interrogated warlords and terrorists, sat across tables from men who'd committed atrocities that would haunt my sleep for years, but nothing in my training had prepared me for the intelligence I saw looking back at me from that corner, ancient and weary and utterly alien in its patience. The Yeti was massive in a way that photographs couldn't capture, easily 8 feet even in its seated position, shoulders broad as doorways, covered in fur that was neither white nor gray but something between, like accumulated centuries of mountain mist had taken physical form. But it was the face that unmade me, because beneath the pronounced brow and the features that evolution had sculpted for high-altitude survival, there was something heartbreakingly familiar in its structure, in the way its mouth curved with what might have been sadness, in the way its massive hands rested gently on its knees like a monk in meditation. Those hands could have torn through the restraints they'd fitted it with, through the concrete walls, through me, but instead they lay still with a deliberateness that spoke of choice, of surrender, of a patience that had outlasted empires. Its eyes found mine and held them, and I felt the impact of that gaze like a physical thing. Brown irises flecked with gold that caught the harsh lights and reflected them back with an awareness that made my throat tighten with recognition I couldn't name. I moved closer to the glass despite every survival instinct screaming at me to maintain distance, drawn by something I didn't understand then, but recognized now as the pull of truth, of answers to questions humanity had been asking since we first looked up at mountains and wondered what lived in their unreachable places. The creature didn't move, didn't react, just continued that unwavering observation as if it were reading something written in my face, in my posture, in the way my hand trembled slightly as I reached out to touch the barrier between us. The glass was cold enough to burn. Or perhaps that was just my nerves translating sensation into something I could process, something less overwhelming than standing before a myth made flesh and finding it more real than anything I'd ever believed in. I tried to speak, to offer some kind of greeting or interrogation protocol, but the words died in my mouth because what do you say to something that shouldn't exist? How do you assert authority over a being that was ancient when your ancestors were learning to make fire? It shifted slightly, a subtle adjustment that made no sound, but changed everything about the space between us, and I saw its eyes track downward to my chest, to where my grandfather's compass hung on a chain. Beneath my uniform, the brass warm against my skin from body heat and inherited history. I hadn't even consciously reached for it, but my hand had found its way there, fingers closing around the metal casing with its worn engravings, symbols I'd never fully understood despite the stories my grandfather had told me about his years in these mountains, about the things he'd seen that he could never speak of publicly. The reaction was immediate and impossible to misinterpret, the Yeti's entire posture changing from passive observation to focused attention, its eyes widening slightly as it leaned forward with a movement so fluid it seemed to flow rather than shift. I pulled the compass out slowly, holding it up to the light, watching as the creature's gaze fixed on the symbols carved into its surface. Old markings that predated any military service, designs that looked like no language I'd studied, but which my grandfather had said were protection, were blessing, were recognition from the old guardians of high places. The being made a sound then, not quite vocalization, not quite breath, something between a sigh and a word that resonated in my chest like distant thunder, like the mountain itself acknowledging something it had thought forgotten. Its hand moved, slow and deliberate, raising to mirror my gesture, and I saw that its palm bore markings, not scars exactly, but patterns in the skin beneath the fur, whorls and lines that matched the compass symbols with impossible precision. We stood there frozen in that moment of mutual recognition, separated by reinforced glass and centuries of misunderstanding, connected by symbols older than the facility, older than nations, older than the histories we'd written that had no space for beings like this. I felt something crack open in my chest, not breaking but opening, like a door I'd never known was locked suddenly swinging wide to reveal rooms I'd spent my whole life walking past without seeing. Behind me I could hear the observation team, speaking in urgent whispers, could feel their cameras recording, could sense their fear disguised as scientific protocol, but all of that felt distant and irrelevant compared to the weight of that gaze, compared to the terrible understanding beginning to dawn, that this wasn't a creature at all, This was a witness, a survivor, a keeper of truths we'd spent our entire civilization trying to forget. And the sorrow in those two human eyes wasn't just personal grief, but the accumulated weight of watching humanity make the same mistakes over and over while beings like this tried and failed to guide us toward wisdom instead of destruction. The Yeti lowered its hand slowly, placed it flat against the glass, fingers spread wide in a gesture that was somehow both greeting and goodbye, both warning and invitation, and without thinking I matched it, my palm pressing against the cold barrier directly opposite, feeling the temperature drop even further, as if something was passing between us through the molecular structure of the reinforced glass. For just a moment I felt it, not words exactly but impressions. Vast stretches of time compressed into sensation, the weight of millennia spent watching from mountains while below in the valleys civilizations rose and fell like seasons, each one thinking itself eternal, each one blind to the patterns that those who watched from high places could see with heartbreaking clarity. I pulled my hand back gasping, the contact breaking like a physical snap, leaving me dizzy and disoriented with the echo of something vast and sad reverberating through my thoughts. The creature settled back into its corner, eyes never leaving mine, waiting with the patience of stones for me to understand what it had just shown me, for me to begin comprehending that this interrogation was already going in directions no one had anticipated, because the real question wasn't what this being was or where it had come from, but what it knew, what it had been trying to tell us from the margins of our awareness, and whether we were finally ready to listen before it was too late. I spent 3 days attempting standard interrogation protocols before admitting what I'd known from that first moment of contact, that this being operated on frequencies beyond military procedure, beyond threats or bargaining, or the psychological pressure techniques I'd perfected over years of extracting information from hostile subjects. The Yeti remained in its meditative stillness, responding to questions with that same ancient patience, not defiant, but simply beyond the framework of what we were asking, as if we were children demanding the ocean explain itself. In terms of puddles, my superiors grew increasingly frustrated through the observation speakers, demanding results that justified the extraordinary resources devoted to this facility, to the decades of searches that had finally succeeded, to the international incidents that would inevitably follow once word leaked that we'd captured something the world had spent centuries dismissing as fantasy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that capture was the wrong word entirely, that this being had allowed itself to be found, had walked into our nets and tranquilizer range with full knowledge of what would follow, and that realization terrified me more than any threat assessment briefing. On the 4th morning I entered the containment room alone, against protocol, carrying nothing but my grandfather's compass and a desperation that felt like drowning on dry land. The creature's eyes tracked me as I approached, that same penetrating awareness that seemed to see through flesh and rank, and the armor of certainty I'd built around myself through military service. I held up the compass slowly, letting it catch the fluorescent light, watching the engravings throw shadows against my palm like living things. Moving beneath the brass surface, the Yeti made that resonant sound again, deeper this time, almost like recognition mixed with mourning. And then it did something that made my heart stutter in my chest. It spoke, not in English, not in any language I'd studied during intelligence training, but in something older, syllables that felt like weather, patterns given voice, like wind through high passes shaped into meaning. I shouldn't have understood it, had no linguistic framework for comprehension, yet somehow through the connection we'd established through symbols and touch I caught the edges of meaning the way you catch scent on the air, fragmentary but real. The word it repeated sounded like guardian filtered through mountain acoustics, through centuries of isolation, through grief so profound it had become part of the being's fundamental nature. I moved closer to the glass, pressing the compass against its surface, and the Yeti mirrored the gesture with its marked palm, the symbols aligning through the barrier like keys. Finding locks, they were shaped for across impossible spans of time. The temperature in the room plummeted so suddenly that my breath became visible, crystallizing in the air between us, as the fluorescent lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, almost deliberate. Through the glass I felt rather than heard vibration, a frequency that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my bones, in my teeth, in the base of my skull where instinct lives deeper than thought. The Yeti's eyes held mine as it began making gestures, with its free hand, slow deliberate movements that reminded me of sign language but older, more fundamental, each motion carrying weight beyond simple communication. It pointed to the symbols on the compass, then to its own chest, then swept its arm in a vast arc that somehow encompassed not just the room but beyond. The mountains, the valleys, the curve of the planet itself. I understood then with a clarity that felt like falling that these symbols weren't just decorative, weren't simple tribal markings or religious iconography. They were a language of relationship, a way of marking those who had been recognized by the mountain guardians, who had been deemed trustworthy enough to carry proof of that recognition through the lower world. My grandfather hadn't just served in these mountains. He'd encountered something. Someone had been chosen or marked or blessed in ways he could never explain to a world that wouldn't believe. And he'd passed that recognition down to me through inheritance. And stories I'd thought were just old man's nostalgia. The Yeti withdrew its hand slowly, and the temperature stabilized as if released from some tremendous pressure, leaving me shaking and covered in cold sweat that had nothing to do with environmental conditions. It settled back with that fluid grace that something so massive shouldn't possess. But its eyes never left mine, and in them I saw expectation mixed with something like hope, the first emotion beyond sorrow I'd witnessed in that ancient gaze. Through broken syllables and gestures it began showing me, not telling but demonstrating through movement and sound, how its kind had watched humanity's dawn, had tried to guide without controlling, had left symbols and wisdom in the languages of high places that some few humans throughout history had understood and carried back down to the world that needed them. My grandfather had been one of those carriers, had earned his compass through some encounter he'd never fully described, and now I stood in his place facing the source of those old stories, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility settling onto my shoulders like snow accumulation, gradual but inexorable, transforming everything it touched into something new and strange and infinitely more fragile than what existed before. I began visiting the containment room outside my scheduled observation hours, drawn back by something deeper than professional duty or curiosity, by a pull that felt ancient and inevitable, like salmon returning to spawning grounds they've never consciously seen but recognize in their cellular memory. The Yeti seemed to anticipate these visits, positioning itself near the glass partition before I arrived, as if it could sense my approach through rock and steel, and the electromagnetic fields that supposedly secured the facility. We developed a rhythm of communication that transcended language, a dance of gesture and symbol where I would trace the engravings on my grandfather's compass, and the creature would respond with movements that carved meaning into the air between us, each session building on the last like sedimentary layers of understanding compressed into something solid and permanent. My colleagues noticed the change in me, the way I'd grown quiet and distant, the way I'd stopped eating in the commissary to avoid their questions about progress, about results, about when we'd extract actionable intelligence from our impossible prisoner. But how could I explain that intelligence was the wrong framework entirely? That what was happening in that sterile room had nothing to do with military advantage and everything to do with recognition, with one consciousness acknowledging another across a divide we'd spent centuries pretending didn't exist. During our 7th session, the Yeti pressed both palms against the glass and held them there, steady and patient, until I understood the invitation and mirrored the gesture from my side of the barrier. The cold that radiated through the reinforced surface felt alive, purposeful, not the simple absence of heat but the presence of something else, some energy that existed outside our standard physics classifications. Through that contact point, I felt vibration that resolved into rhythm, into patterns that reminded me of heartbeat but slower, deeper, synchronized with something vast and patient like geological time made visceral and immediate. The creature's eyes never left mine as images began forming in my mind, not imposed but offered, like memories surfacing from depths I'd never accessed before. Visions of mountain ranges when they were young and sharp-edged, of valleys carved by glaciers that moved with the patience of eternity, of forests so ancient and vast they created their own weather systems in the breathing exchange between leaf and sky. I saw humanity then as the Yeti's kind had first witnessed us, small bands of clever primates, descending from the trees, learning fire and tool use and the dangerous gift of imagination that let us conceive of worlds beyond what existed, that let us dream of transformation and carry those dreams forward into reality. Through stubborn determination and breathtaking adaptability, the Guardians had watched us with what I can only describe as cautious fascination, seeing in our species something unprecedented, something that could go either way, toward wisdom or destruction, toward integration with the living world or domination of it. The visions shifted and I saw the Guardians attempting guidance, appearing to shamans and mystics in high places where the veil between worlds grew thin, leaving symbols carved in stone and ice that carried wisdom about balance, about reciprocity, about the fundamental truth that humans were not separate from nature, but expressions of it, powerful and dangerous in equal measure. Some humans understood and carried these teachings down to their tribes, becoming the wisdom keepers and medicine carriers whose traditions still echoed faintly in the folklore my grandfather had collected, in the stories dismissed as superstition by the modern world that valued only what could be measured and exploited. But as human civilization grew more complex and powerful, the guardians faced an impossible dilemma: how to guide without controlling, how to warn without creating dependency, how to let a species make its own choices while watching it stumble toward consequences that could destroy not just itself, but the intricate web of life it was embedded in. I felt the Yeti's grief then as my own. Centuries of watching civilizations rise and flourish and collapse under the weight of their own cleverness, of seeing the same patterns repeat with variations but always the same underlying trajectory: expansion without wisdom, power without responsibility, the fatal assumption that natural limits could be overcome through innovation, rather than respected through humility. The creature withdrew its hands slowly, and I gasped as the connection severed, stumbling backward with tears streaming down my face for reasons I couldn't articulate, mourning for losses I hadn't experienced directly, but now carried in my cellular memory. Like inherited trauma, I sat heavily on the observation stool, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd experienced, whether it was genuine communication or some kind of psychological projection born from isolation and the strangeness of the situation. But the Yeti was making that resonant sound again, softer now, almost gentle, and through our developing vocabulary of gesture it touched its chest, then pointed to me, then swept its arm to indicate the world beyond our containment room. The message clear despite the lack of shared language: we were connected now, guardian and witness, across the barrier of species and time and all the certainty I'd built my career on, connected by recognition that went deeper than reason, that operated on frequencies the modern world had forgotten how to hear. The creature's eyes held something like approval mixed with sorrow, as if it knew what this knowledge would cost me, how it would separate me from my own kind even as it bound me to something older and more enduring than human civilization. I understood then why my grandfather had never fully explained his compass, why he'd spoken of the mountains with that mixture of reverence and regret, why he'd seemed to carry some burden that made him kind but distant, present but always slightly elsewhere. He'd stood where I stood now, had felt what I was feeling, had accepted the role of witness and carrier that came with recognition, and now that weight passed to me like inheritance, like blessing and curse woven so tightly together they became indistinguishable from each other. The turning point came during our 9th session when the Yeti made that resonant sound. I'd come to recognize as preparation, as a warning that what followed would be difficult, and then pressed both palms against the glass with such intensity that frost patterns bloomed outward from the contact points like crystallized breath. I matched the gesture. Automatically now, our ritual established, but this time when the cold surged through the barrier it carried an urgency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges, as if reality itself was becoming negotiable. The images that flooded my consciousness weren't the patient geological memories of before, but something more immediate and terrible, visions of cities that existed long before Sumeria or Egypt appeared in our textbooks. Civilizations that had reached heights of technological sophistication that made our modern world look primitive by comparison. I saw towers that touched the clouds held aloft by principles of physics we'd forgotten or never discovered, networks of light connecting consciousness across vast distances without wires or satellites, harmonious integration of human ingenuity and natural systems that produced abundance without devastation, beauty without exploitation. But then the vision darkened and I watched those impossible cities begin their collapse, not from external invasion but from internal corruption, from the same fatal pattern repeating, the gradual conviction that human cleverness had transcended natural law, that limits were obstacles to overcome, rather than wisdom to respect, that the earth itself was resource rather than relationship, material rather than mother. I witnessed great machines drilling into the planet's depths to extract energies that should have remained sequestered, saw the atmosphere change color as industrial processes multiplied beyond the Earth's capacity to absorb and transform their outputs, felt the climate shift and buckle under the weight of human assumption. The images came faster, Now, more violent, showing me earthquakes that shattered those beautiful towers, droughts that turned agricultural centers into dust bowls, floods that swallowed coastal cities as ice caps melted and ocean chemistry changed in ways that cascaded through food chains until whole ecosystems collapsed like dominoes falling in slow motion. I saw populations displaced and desperate, fighting over diminishing resources while their leaders insisted the crisis was temporary, manageable, someone else's fault, anything but the natural consequence of choices made across generations, of systems designed for endless growth on a finite planet. The Yeti's grief poured through our contact point like freezing water, the accumulated sorrow of having witnessed this pattern repeat not once, but multiple times across epochs of human history, watching species after species develop consciousness and tool use, and the dangerous gift of imagination only, to direct those gifts toward destruction rather than wisdom. And woven through every image was the guardian's presence, trying to warn, trying to guide, leaving symbols and appearing to mystics and offering wisdom that was sometimes heeded briefly, before being dismissed as primitive superstition by civilizations convinced their sophistication made them immune to nature's laws. What broke me wasn't just the scale of destruction in those ancient collapses, but the terrible recognition that followed. The way the Yeti's next images showed me our modern world with the same markers already visible, the same trajectory already locked in unless something fundamental shifted. I saw the melting permafrost releasing ancient methane, the ocean acidification destroying coral reefs that protected coastlines and nursed marine biodiversity, the insect populations crashing as pesticides and habitat loss compounded into cascading failure. I saw the weather patterns destabilizing into chaos, droughts and floods and fires increasing in frequency and intensity, migration patterns disrupted for species that depended on precise timing, temperatures rising past critical thresholds that triggered feedback loops we couldn't reverse even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow. And underneath it all I felt the Earth's system straining, the intricate web of relationships between soil and water, and air and living things beginning to tear as we pushed beyond resilience thresholds, as we treated symptoms while ignoring root causes, as we told ourselves stories of technological salvation while accelerating toward the same cliff edge that had claimed those impossible civilizations whose ruins we'd never find, because they'd been ground to dust by geological time. The Yeti showed me refugee camps that didn't exist yet, but would, showed me children who would never know stable seasons or abundant wildlife, showed me the military operations I'd participated in recontextualized as symptoms of resource scarcity and climate disruption, conflicts manufactured by systems under terminal stress. When the creature finally withdrew its hands, I collapsed to my knees, vomiting onto the sterile floor as my body rejected what my mind had absorbed, trying to purge knowledge that couldn't be unlearned or forgotten. The Yeti watched with those impossibly ancient eyes that held compassion without pity, recognition without judgment, the steady gaze of something that had witnessed apocalypse before and understood that human consciousness could hold truth and denial simultaneously. The recovery took hours, or perhaps days. Time had become unreliable in that facility where artificial light never changed, and the presence of something impossible distorted normal perception, like gravity bending space around a massive object. When I could finally stand again, legs trembling and throat raw, I found the Yeti had moved to the far corner of its containment, seated in that unnaturally still way it had, waiting with the patience of mountains for me to return to myself enough to continue. Dr. Chen appeared with water and concerned questions I couldn't answer, because how do you explain that you've just witnessed the death of worlds, that history isn't linear progress but a cycle of rise and catastrophic fall, that everything we've been taught about human exceptionalism might be the very delusion that dooms us? I waved her away and approached the glass again, this time not with military authority or scientific curiosity, but with something closer to supplication, the posture of someone seeking wisdom from a teacher whose lessons are written in extinction events and geological memory. The Yeti's eyes tracked my movement, and I saw recognition there, acknowledgement that something had shifted in me fundamentally, that the barrier between us was no longer just reinforced glass and species difference, but a choice I would have to make about which story I believed, which future I would serve. When it began communicating again, the method had changed, evolved somehow, as if the sharing of apocalyptic visions had opened channels between us that allowed for more nuanced transmission. The creature gestured to itself, then swept its massive arm in an arc that seemed to encompassed the mountains beyond our underground prison, and spoke in that resonant combination of sound and deeper vibration that bypassed language to convey meaning directly. What I understood shattered another layer of assumptions I'd carried my entire military career, beliefs so fundamental I'd never thought to question them. The Yeti and its kind hadn't simply watched humanity from a distance like detached observers studying insects, but had actively tried to guide us, again and again across millennia, appearing to shamans and mystics and those humans still connected enough to nature to recognize wisdom when it manifested. They had been the teachers behind mystery traditions, the truth behind legends of wise mountain spirits and forest guardians, entities who tried to share the knowledge of cycles and consequences that their long existence had taught them. The creature showed me fragments of these interventions, mental images of its ancestors appearing to early humans with gifts of agricultural wisdom that worked with natural systems rather than against them, warnings about overhunting that some tribes heeded and enshrined in taboo and ritual, demonstrations of reciprocity and balance that became the foundation of indigenous practices, later dismissed as primitive by civilizations racing toward complexity and collapse. But woven through these images of attempted guidance was a darker thread, a pattern of rejection and eventually persecution that explained why these guardians had retreated into legend and myth, why they hid in the most remote and hostile environments where human expansion hadn't yet penetrated. The Yeti showed me how its kind had been hunted as monsters when their warnings became inconvenient to societies committed to expansion, how they'd been killed and displayed as trophies or freaks, how their wisdom had been distorted into cautionary tales that missed the point entirely, bedtime stories about creatures in the wilderness rather than teachers offering survival knowledge. I saw guardian after guardian fall to human weapons as we grew more sophisticated in our capacity for violence. Watched the survivors retreat higher into mountains and deeper into forests, their numbers dwindling as our numbers exploded and our hunger for resources pushed into every corner of the planet. The creature's sorrow over this history was profound but not resentful. That was what devastated me most, the absence of anger or desire for revenge, only a tired sadness at opportunities missed, at wisdom rejected, at a species so brilliant and so blind simultaneously. It showed me cave paintings and rock carvings its kind had left as messages, symbols that archaeologists had cataloged and misinterpreted, reducing sophisticated warnings about ecological balance to primitive art or shamanistic decoration, never imagining they were instructions from teachers who'd watched previous human civilizations make the same mistakes we were making now. The revelation that broke through my last defenses came when the Yeti showed me why it had allowed itself to be captured after centuries of successful evasion, why it hadn't fled or fought when our team had cornered it in that high valley, where the helicopters struggled for lift in the thin air. The creature had chosen this, had deliberately walked into our trap, because its kind had decided on a final intervention, one last attempt to warn humanity before we crossed thresholds that would make collapse inevitable and recovery impossible. The Yeti fixed me with those ancient eyes, and I understood with sudden terrible clarity that I hadn't been assigned to this project randomly, that my family compass with its folklore symbols hadn't been coincidental, that I'd been selected or perhaps called because somewhere in my lineage was a connection to those humans who had listened before, who had carried guardian wisdom forward in stories and traditions and symbols carved into inherited objects. I was meant to be a bridge, a translator, someone who could carry the message from this imprisoned teacher back to a world that desperately needed to hear it but had long ago stopped believing such teachers existed. The Yeti rose to its full height then, a movement so deliberate and weighted with purpose that every alarm in my military training screamed threat assessment, even as something deeper in me recognized ritual, the formal beginning of testimony that couldn't be delivered sitting down. It moved to the center of the containment cell where the lights were brightest and most unforgiving, positioning itself where every camera would capture what came next. And I realized it was performing not just for me, but for whoever would eventually review this footage, for the chain of command that would decide its fate and perhaps humanity's as well. The creature began to speak in that layered voice that was becoming easier to understand, as if my brain was adapting to its frequency. And what it revealed was so precisely catastrophic that I felt my hands go numb against the glass. The signs weren't coming, it conveyed with terrible clarity. They were already here, already accelerating, the same cascade of environmental and social collapse that had preceded every extinction event it had witnessed. The Yeti gestured, and my mind filled with images that weren't ancient history, but present day. Glaciers calving into dark water centuries before models predicted, ocean currents shifting in ways that would devastate agriculture, temperature patterns becoming chaotic and unpredictable, and woven through it all, the creature showed me how these weren't separate crises, but symptoms of a single systemic breakdown. The planet's regulatory systems failing because we'd pushed too hard against too many boundaries simultaneously. What made it unbearable was how it connected these environmental collapses to social disintegration, showing me how resource scarcity would trigger conflicts that my military spent billions preparing for, without addressing root causes. How climate refugees would overwhelm borders and shatter political systems. How the complexity we'd built our civilization upon would become catastrophic fragility when the foundation shook. The creature moved closer to the glass, and I saw my reflection superimposed over its face. Human and guardian merged in the translucent surface, and it showed me the timeline we were on with the precision of something that had watched this pattern repeat across millennia. We had perhaps 2 decades, maybe 3 if we acted immediately and drastically, before crossing thresholds beyond which feedback loops would become unstoppable, where the melting permafrost would release enough methane to accelerate warming beyond any mitigation efforts, where ocean acidification would collapse food chains that billions depended upon, where the intricate systems of agriculture and water management and supply chains that kept our massive population alive would begin failing in cascading waves. The Yeti's communication became more urgent, almost desperate, and I felt its frustration at trying to compress evolutionary timescales and ecological complexity into concepts a short-lived human could grasp and act upon. It showed me how previous civilizations had reached similar inflection points, moments where they could have changed course but didn't because the required changes threatened power structures and economic models that benefited those making decisions. How elites had always chosen short-term preservation of privilege over long-term species survival. How by the time the consequences became undeniable, it was too late to prevent collapse, only suffer through it. I saw cities abandoned to rising water and endless drought, agricultural regions transformed to desert, mass migrations that made current refugee crises look trivial, and the wars, the desperate resource wars that would consume what remained of civilization's energy in mutual destruction rather than cooperative survival. But the most horrifying revelation came when the Yeti showed me how this cycle served a function, how these periodic collapses were almost like pruning, like forest fires that cleared deadwood, resetting human populations and technological complexity to levels the planet could sustain long-term. The creature conveyed that Earth would survive our collapse as it had survived others, that life would recover and adapt as it always had, but humanity as we knew it, this particular expression of consciousness and culture and accumulated knowledge, would be reduced to scattered survivors carrying fragments of wisdom into a darker age, starting over with the burden of ruins and radiation and depleted resources that would make the next climb toward complexity even harder. The Guardian's kind had tried to help previous iterations of human civilization avoid this fate, to break the cycle, to guide us toward sustainable complexity that could persist rather than cancerous growth that always ended in systemic failure. But we never listened long enough, never changed fundamentally enough, always found ways to rationalize continuing the patterns that felt profitable and powerful right up until they became catastrophic. And the Yeti's despair at watching us repeat these mistakes with even more sophisticated tools and global reach was crushing in its weight and intimacy. The creature placed one massive hand against the glass and I mirrored the gesture without thinking, my palm tiny against its own. And through that connection it showed me the final devastating truth. The military operations I'd dedicated my life to, the defense systems and strategic planning and power projection that had earned me decorations and promotions, were accelerating the very collapse they were meant to protect against. Every base we built in fragile ecosystems, every training exercise that poisoned groundwater, every conflict over resources that could have been shared, every dollar spent on weapons instead of transformation was another step toward the precipice. And I had been a faithful servant of that acceleration, believing I was protecting civilization while actually serving its suicide. The Yeti showed me satellite images I recognized from briefings, but revealed their true meaning: deforestation for military installations, ocean dead zones from naval exercises, carbon emissions from operations, and the obscene resource consumption of war machines that could have rebuilt entire ecosystems if redirected. I saw my own role in this system with sudden terrible clarity. How my competence and dedication had made me complicit. How every successful mission had been another small victory for the mindset that was destroying us. And the weight of that realization drove me to my knees before the glass, forehead pressed against the cold surface, while the Guardian watched with those sorrowful ancient eyes that had seen this moment of terrible understanding dawn in other humans across other dying civilizations, this recognition that we are both victim and perpetrator, both the destroyed and the destroyer, trapped in a pattern we can barely perceive, let alone break. I don't know how long I stayed on my knees before that glass, forehead pressed against the cold surface while my reflection stared back, fractured and distorted. But when I finally looked up, the Yeti was closer still, its massive form filling my entire field of vision. And those eyes held something beyond sorrow now, something like recognition that I had crossed into understanding few humans survived intact. The creature began showing me my own memories, but transformed, recontextualized through its ancient perspective, and I watched my decorated career play out like a horror film, where the hero slowly realizes he's been the monster. All along, every counterinsurgency operation became clearer as resource war. Every strategic partnership revealed as exploitation of fragile regions. Every classified briefing I'd attended was suddenly transparent in its actual purpose, maintaining systems of extraction and consumption that were actively killing the planet. What destroyed me wasn't judgment from the Yeti, but its complete absence. Just this terrible, compassionate witness as I watched myself unknowingly serve extinction, believing every moment I was honorable, necessary, protecting people I loved from threats that were real enough but symptoms of the deeper disease I was helping spread. The Guardian showed me my own children in images from my wallet that had somehow perceived and reflected back, and I saw them not in the safe future I'd convinced myself I was securing, but in the collapsing world we were actually creating, inheriting catastrophes that would make my war zones look peaceful. And I broke, genuinely broke, a sound coming from my throat that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal, just pure grief for everything we were losing and hadn't yet admitted we'd already lost. The Yeti responded to my collapse not with victory, but with something worse, a kind of desperate urgency that suggested even this moment of understanding might not be enough, might be too late, might be just one more human. Finally seeing truth moments before extinction made that truth irrelevant. It showed me the facility around us, this secret installation carved into sacred mountains, powered by generators burning fossil fuels to contain a guardian that had tried to warn us. The perfect crystallized metaphor for how we respond to wisdom that threatens our comfort. Capture it, study it, neutralize it, classify it beyond public awareness, and continue exactly as before. The creature conveyed that this had happened before, that previous civilizations had likewise imprisoned or killed the guardians who tried to intervene. And I understood with sickening clarity why its kind had withdrawn into legend, why they'd stopped trying to help. Because help was always perceived as threat by the power structures most invested in unsustainable paths, and the messengers were always destroyed before the message could take root. I felt the Yeti's loneliness then, truly felt it. This being that had watched humanity for thousands of years with some mixture of hope and dread, seeing flashes of wisdom and beauty in us, but watching us repeatedly choose destruction, witnessing the pattern repeat with the helpless horror of someone watching a child run toward a cliff. And that loneliness mirrored something in me I'd suppressed my entire military career. The isolation of seeing systems clearly while being trapped inside them, of knowing truth that couldn't be spoken without destroying yourself, of loving humanity while recognizing we might be fundamentally incapable of the wisdom our survival requires. Then the creature did something that shattered whatever remained of my psychological defenses. It showed me the moments I could have chosen differently. Decision points in my career where I'd felt doubt but suppressed it for advancement. Briefings where I'd suspected lies but stayed silent for security clearance. Operations where I'd witnessed atrocities but filed reports that sanitized them into acceptable narratives. The Yeti wasn't condemning these choices, but revealing them as the thousand small complicity moments that sustained destructive systems, showing me how my personal integrity and professional excellence had been weaponized against transformation. How being good at my job made me part of the problem because the job itself served extinction. What made this unbearable wasn't shame, though shame was certainly present, but the realization that everyone in the chain of command above and below me had similar moments, similar rationalizations, similar small surrenders of conscience to careerism and tribal loyalty. And together these individual compromises created institutional momentum that no single person could stop, a distributed responsibility that meant everyone was guilty and no one was accountable. The Guardian showed me generals and politicians and corporate executives all trapped in the same pattern, individually decent people serving collectively suicidal systems, and I understood why previous civilizations failed to change course, because the change required was so total, so threatening to existing power and identity, that it felt impossible even when extinction was visible on the horizon, especially then, when those with most to lose from transformation had the most resources to deny reality and suppress alternatives until denial became fate. The Yeti pulled back slightly, and I saw myself in the glass again, really saw myself, uniform crisp and decorated, face aged by stress and classified knowledge, eyes haunted by things I couldn't unsee, and behind my reflection the ancient guardian that represented everything my civilization had forgotten and everything we needed to remember to survive. The creature conveyed its final, devastating message, that I would leave this room changed but probably not enough, that I would try to speak these truths and be marginalized or destroyed, that the systems I served had antibodies against exactly this kind of awakening, protocols for containing personnel who'd been psychologically compromised by encounters with paradigm-threatening reality. It showed me my likely future with the casual cruelty of complete honesty, psych evaluation, medical discharge, veterans benefits carefully calibrated to keep me comfortable enough to stay quiet about what I'd learned. My warnings dismissed as breakdown by colleagues who needed to believe the mission was righteous and the trajectory sustainable because admitting otherwise would require confronting their own complicity. The Yeti conveyed that this too was part of the pattern, how civilizations approaching collapse always silenced prophets and murdered messengers, how the truth became literally unthinkable precisely when thinking it was most necessary, and I felt the trap close around me, understanding that I was already being disappeared by systems that would never allow this encounter to change anything, that the cameras recording this session would be classified beyond access, that the decision about what to do with this guardian had already been made by people who couldn't afford to let it live because its existence questioned everything their power depended upon. And I was just theater, just procedure, just one more witness to be neutralized through discharge or discredit, or if necessary more permanent solutions. And the weight of that future combined with the crushing knowledge the Yeti had shared drove me beyond breaking into some new state that had no name, where grief and rage and love and despair merged into something that felt like either enlightenment or insanity. And perhaps in our current moment those two states were indistinguishable. Perhaps the only sane response to understanding what we were doing to ourselves was a madness that looked like wisdom to those few capable of recognizing it. And I knelt there in that threshold between old certainties and terrible new knowledge, forever changed but uncertain if change was enough, if anything could be enough, if we'd already crossed the point where individual transformation mattered against the momentum of collective suicide. While the Guardian watched with those ancient sorrowful eyes that had witnessed this exact moment of human consciousness countless times before, this awakening that came too late or was suppressed too quickly, or simply couldn't spread fast enough through populations invested in comfortable lies. And outside the containment room I heard footsteps approaching, multiple sets, purposeful and official, and I knew my time with impossible truth was ending, that I would have to choose soon between the life I'd built serving extinction and some unknown path that might not even exist, that might be just another form of futility, but at least would be futile in service of something that mattered, something older and deeper than the shallow certainties of the military-industrial complex. And I looked into the Yeti's eyes one final time before the door opened and everything changed forever. Those eyes holding millennia of wisdom and warning, reflecting back to me both what I had been and what I might still become if I found the courage that had failed so many humans before me. And the door handle turned with the cold mechanical sound of systems reasserting control, and I had perhaps seconds to decide who I would be and what came next. And the Guardian's hand remained pressed against the glass, waiting to see if this encounter would be just one more futile warning or the beginning of something different, something that might somehow against all historical precedent actually matter. And I didn't know, genuinely didn't know if I was strong enough or awake enough or brave enough for what that would require. But I pressed my hand harder against the glass in answer, in commitment, in recognition that some truths once seen cannot be unseen. and whatever came through that door would be met by a different version of me than had entered this room. Someone irrevocably altered by contact with the impossible, carrying knowledge that was either salvation or damnation depending on what I chose to do with it. And the Yeti nodded once, slowly, a gesture that felt like both blessing and warning. And the door opened. The officers who entered were not the scientists I expected, but tactical units, faceless behind visors that reduced human judgment to protocol execution. And their weapons were raised not at me, but past me toward the containment cell. And I understood immediately that this was termination, that the decision had been made in some classified briefing room by people who would never look into those ancient eyes, who would only see threat in a database, existential risk in a PowerPoint presentation that reduced millennia of guardianship to a containment problem requiring permanent solution. Behind me I felt the Yeti's awareness of what was coming, not fear exactly, but a profound sadness that held the weight of prophecy fulfilled, because of course we would respond to wisdom with violence. Of course we would destroy what we couldn't control. Of course the pattern would repeat exactly as it had with previous civilizations, who'd likewise murdered their last warnings before collapsing into the silence that consumed them. The squad leader was speaking to me, words about securing the area and psychological evaluation and my service being valued, the careful language of systems managing their own contradictions. And I was supposed to step aside, supposed to return to role and let procedure proceed, supposed to trust that classified decisions served classified purposes that protected classified interests, and every instinct trained into me over decades of military service said comply. But standing between armed soldiers and the Guardian, I felt those instincts shatter against something deeper than conditioning, some fundamental recognition that this moment contained everything, that stepping aside was stepping away from the last chance at truth that might ever be offered to me. I didn't make a conscious decision so much as surrender to something already decided in the part of me that had recognized the Yeti not as threat but as mirror, and I moved not away but toward the containment controls, hands reaching for the emergency release that every facility had for catastrophic containment failure. And I saw weapons track toward me, saw the squad leader's hand signal abort, but not quite fast enough, and I pulled the release that opened the reinforced doors with alarm screaming, like the facility's nervous system responding to violation of its primary directive. The Yeti moved with shocking speed for something so massive, not attacking but flowing past me toward the corridor with ancient intelligence that understood escape routes before layouts were built. And the soldiers faced an impossible choice between firing at me, firing at it, or pursuing. And in their hesitation I saw the human beneath protocol, the moment of uncertainty that systems couldn't quite eliminate. Chaos erupted as the Guardian moved through the facility with purpose that suggested it had always known this architecture, had perhaps watched this installation being built into mountains that belonged to its kind, long before humans arrived with their generators and containment cells. And I followed not with plan, but with certainty that my old life was ending whether I survived the next minutes or not, that releasing the creature was releasing myself from complicity that had been slowly destroying me. Through every rationalization and compromise, we moved through corridors where scientists scattered and alarms created disorienting soundscapes that felt appropriate for the dissolution of certainty, and I had my service weapon, but pointed it only at personnel trying to block our path, never firing, just buying seconds with threat while the Yeti navigated toward exit, or perhaps toward some destination it had always intended. We reached an external airlock where wind howled with Himalayan fury, and the Guardian paused, turning to face me with those impossibly human eyes that now held something like gratitude mixed with sorrow for what I'd sacrificed, what I'd lose, what this choice would cost in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. And it conveyed without words that my gesture changed nothing about humanity's trajectory, that one military officer choosing conscience over orders wouldn't stop the civilizational collapse already in motion. But perhaps it changed something about me. Perhaps it proved that individual humans could still break conditioning, even when breaking served no strategic purpose, demonstrated only moral coherence in the face of coordinated insanity. The Yeti reached toward me, and I didn't flinch as its massive hand touched my chest. And I felt something transfer, not physical, but some kind of awareness or protection or simply acknowledgement, that I had chosen witness over complicity, that I would carry what I'd learned into whatever remained of my life. Then the Guardian turned toward the howling blizzard and moved into whiteness that swallowed it immediately, becoming snow and mountain and legend again. and I stood at the threshold watching the impossible disappear while behind me I heard the tactical units approaching, and I raised my hands in surrender, knowing I would be detained and debriefed and destroyed systematically by institutions protecting themselves from truth. But standing in that doorway between warm facility and wild mountain, I felt more at peace than I had in decades of service, because I had finally chosen rightly, even if I'd chosen too late, even if it wouldn't matter, even if I would spend whatever remained of my freedom trying to speak warnings no one with power would hear, because the Yeti had shown me that trying mattered even in futility, that bearing witness was resistance when systems demanded blindness. And his hands grabbed me and pulled me back from the threshold. I looked into the blizzard where something ancient had vanished into myth again, and I knew I would spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of what that creature had shown me, trying to honor the trust of a guardian who had revealed our greatest enemy was never monsters and mountains, but the comfortable lies we told ourselves about the sustainability of our own monstrous systems. And whether I succeeded or failed, whether anyone believed me or I died discredited and alone, I would carry those ancient sorrowful eyes as compass toward whatever truth remained available to humans willing to see clearly. And the blizzard raged on, indifferent and eternal, while the facility sealed itself against the cold and against the knowledge that had briefly escaped its containment. And I let them take me because I was already free in the only way that mattered, already changed beyond their capacity to restore me to useful ignorance, already haunted by wisdom that felt like curse and blessing equally. And the last thing I saw before they pulled me inside was snow falling eternally over mountains that had watched countless civilizations rise and fall, and would watch ours do the same, patient and ancient and utterly without mercy, exactly as we deserved. They held me in isolation for 72 hours in a windowless room where time became theoretical, and interrogation became atmospheric, a constant pressure of disappointed authority figures who spoke about my service record like a eulogy, about psychological breaks and stress-related decisions, constructing a narrative that would contain what happened within frameworks of individual failure, rather than institutional horror. And I let them build their fictions because I understood they needed my collapse to be medical rather than moral, needed my choice to be aberration rather than clarity, because if a decorated officer could reject orders based on conscience, then the entire chain of command became questionable. The whole apparatus of justified violence became vulnerable to individual ethical judgment, and that possibility terrified them more than any creature ever could. They showed me documents to sign that would medicalize my rebellion, offered early retirement with benefits and psychiatric support, promised comfortable forgetting if I would just accept their version, where trauma had temporarily compromised my judgment rather than clarified it. And I saw the mercy in their offer, the genuine belief that they were saving me from consequences of actions I didn't understand, and perhaps they were right that I didn't fully comprehend what I'd done. But I understood enough to know I couldn't unsee what the Yeti had shown me, couldn't return to useful blindness no matter how comfortable they made the accommodation. When they finally released me into a carefully managed exit from service, I had no clearance, no access, no credibility with anyone who mattered, just a pension and a folder full of psychological evaluations that would preemptively discredit anything I might say. And I returned to a world that looked exactly the same, but felt completely different, like I was watching a familiar film knowing how it ended, seeing the signs of civilizational collapse in every news cycle, every environmental report, every system defending itself against necessary change. I tried speaking about what I'd witnessed, carefully at first through proper channels, then desperately through any platform that would listen. And I discovered what prophets have always learned, that warnings about catastrophic trajectories are less welcome than comfortable lies, that people prefer authorities who promise solutions within existing systems over witnesses, who testify that the systems themselves are the pathology. And my military background gave me initial credibility that evaporated the moment I spoke about encounters with legendary creatures and visions of cyclical collapse, because those details sounded like the psychiatric break they'd documented, confirmed the narrative that trauma had damaged me rather than revealed truth. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps I had broken, but I'd broken open rather than down, shattered into a configuration that could hold contradictions their frameworks couldn't, accommodate years passed in a strange exile where I remained physically present, but existentially elsewhere, living in society while no longer believing in its fundamental assumptions, watching environmental systems destabilize and political structures fracture, and people responding with exactly the desperate denial the Yeti had shown me in previous civilizations, and I felt the loneliness of knowledge that couldn't be shared, the isolation of seeing clearly while surrounded by determined blindness. But I also felt connected to something older than nations, aligned with patterns deeper than human institutions, part of a continuity of witnesses who'd tried to warn their societies and failed and tried anyway, because the trying was the point, the witness was the resistance. Sometimes in dreams I see those ancient eyes watching from high places, and I wonder if the Yeti and its kind are still out there, still maintaining their vigil over a species that proved unteachable, still holding their sorrowful knowledge of how this story ends. And I wonder what they feel observing our accelerating trajectory toward the collapse they've seen repeated across millennia, whether they grieve for us or simply document our patterns with the detachment of beings who've learned not to expect different outcomes from identical inputs. And I think about guardians who tried to guide us and were hunted into legend, about wisdom we transformed into myth because we couldn't tolerate its implications, about all the warnings we've murdered or marginalized or medicalized throughout history, because we'd rather die comfortable than live accountable. I carry that inherited compass everywhere now, its folkloric symbols meaning more to me than any military insignia I once wore. And sometimes when I'm alone in wild places I trace those carvings and imagine I'm sending signals to watchers in high mountains, messages that say at least one human understands, at least one witness refuses to forget, at least one member of our doomed species chooses to honor the guardians even as we fulfill their darkest prophecies about our nature. And whether those signals reach anything, or simply comfort me in my isolation, I keep sending them because the alternative is surrender to the narrative that what I experienced was delusion rather than revelation, and I cannot surrender that truth without losing the only part of myself that still feels real, still feels aligned with something beyond the systems that are collapsing, exactly as ancient wisdom predicted. And in the end, perhaps that's what the Yeti gave me. Not salvation for humanity, but integrity for one human. Not hope for civilization, but clarity for one conscience. And I live now in the space between worlds, no longer quite belonging to human society, but not transcendent enough to escape it, just bearing witness to the patterns as they play out, honoring the guardians by refusing the comfort of willful blindness, and waiting like they wait, patient and sorrowful, and utterly certain about how stories like ours end, while mountains stand eternal and indifferent, and snow falls on facilities that contain everything except the truth that would free us, if we could bear to see it. And I am haunted, and I am grateful, and I am alone with knowledge that feels like both curse and calling. And somewhere in high places ancient eyes are watching still, witnessing our end as they've witnessed others, holding space for the possibility that someday, some species, some version of intelligence might finally learn what we refuse to understand, might finally choose differently than we chose, might finally prove that consciousness can evolve beyond the self-destructs. That seems to be its inevitable conclusion, but that species won't be us, that chance won't be now. And knowing that with certainty is the terrible gift the guardian gave me, the unbearable wisdom I carry into whatever time remains before the patterns complete themselves, and another civilization joins the silence of all the others who likewise couldn't save themselves from themselves. What truth are you refusing to see because accepting it would cost you everything? Subscribe to witness what happens when comfortable lies finally shatter.